Hello, I'm Dr. Manuel G. Saldivar. I'm a cognitive psychologist and a university faculty member. This video is one in a series associated with a textbook by Jeffrey Levy entitled Psychology, the Science of Human Potential. This is a free open source textbook that's available for anyone to use. A link to this textbook can be found below this video in the description box. The purpose of this video is not to cover every single point in the textbook. Rather, it's meant to give students an overview of the contents and the big ideas, the main themes of every particular chapter. So let's get started. So today we're looking at chapter 8 of Levy's text, and it discusses the general process by which humans grow and develop over our lifespan, over the course of our lives. In this chapter, he focuses on stuff that tends to have the most impact on who we are as human beings at the different stages of our life. In the womb, before we're even born, we're greatly influenced by our heredity, by the genetic inheritance we're getting from our ancestors, as well as by our mother's health. So as a baby who's yet to be born, these are the things that are most important in terms of having an influence, in terms of shaping us as we are growing and developing in our mother's womb. As infants, as toddlers, younger children, the care we receive from our families tends to have a bigger influence on who we are, how we develop, than other factors. There are other factors, of course. Obviously, if we get sick or have some terrible illness, that'll have an effect. But generally, it's what's happening in terms of our upbringing and parenting that tends to have a big influence on us as infants and toddlers. By the time we reach school age, our language abilities have begun to develop more strongly, and we've explored the role of language in prior chapters of the Levy textbook. But you'll remember that the big advantage to humans in terms of the language and speech abilities we have is that they help us integrate the stuff that we have been learning up to that point as younger children with this experience of formal schooling. In terms of learning stuff, certainly, in other words, our brains are developing and reaching a point where we can actually do math, where we can understand grammar, understand scientific concepts, for example. But we also have to navigate or manage the social aspects of being a student, of being in a school setting. As we grow into teenagers, young adults, and beyond, as we grow into adulthood, the factors that most influence the course of our lives are the social and economic circumstances of our birth, our upbringing, so our nurture, as we've discussed before, as well as educations that we receive. In this chapter, chapter 8, Levy discusses various theories of human development. None of these theories are universally accepted necessarily, but the reason we're talking about them is because they each illustrate in a slightly different way the kinds of stuff, the kinds of issues that psychologists consider in trying to help us understand how and why humans develop as they do during the course of their lives. The first theory that Levy discusses in chapter 8 was originally developed by a Swiss psychologist named Jean Piaget. His theory focuses on cognitive development. The chapter goes into much more detail, but basically he divides the human lifespan into different age periods, from birth to 2 years, roughly from age 2 to age 7, 7 to 11, and then 11 and on to later in life. And each of these stages has its own term, but basically the idea that Piaget argues is that depending on our age, that age has the biggest influence on our cognitive abilities. Again, cognitive refers to thinking or the stuff that our brain does. So Piaget argues that ultimately what determines our ability to think, to use our brains to do different things. So for example, why is math maybe easier or typically easier for a 10-year-old than a 2-year-old? Piaget would argue because the 10-year-old has a more developed cognitive process, a more developed brain, and so they're able to do certain kinds of stuff, not just math, but other things, that a 2-year-old couldn't do. A second theory of human development that Levy reviews for us in this chapter, chapter 8, is by a researcher named Lawrence Kohlberg, and these are his stages of moral development. So this focuses on the way in which human beings, according to Kohlberg's argument, learn to deal with other humans and what motivates us to do certain stuff. A lot of this, he argues, is rooted in our sense of morality, our sense of right and wrong. And he identifies 3 different levels, going from the pre-conventional morality, level 1, to conventional morality, and then what he calls in level 3, post-conventional morality. The stuff that motivates us to act in certain ways, to be part of society, he argues in his theory, changes over time. We go from being very young and focusing on, I want to do things that get me rewarded, I want to avoid things that get me punished, to later reaching a place where we start to take into account other people's feelings, desires, attitudes. And then eventually we reach a point, according to Kohlberg, where we develop kind of our own abstract way of thinking about issues like justice or right and wrong. Again, there's a lot of detail here to Kohlberg's theory. I refer you to the reading, but my point here is just to highlight the kinds of questions psychologists ask or think about when looking at this issue of humans developing over time. The final theory that's discussed in chapter 8 of Levy's text is from a researcher named Erik Erikson, and his theory is regarding the stages of identity development. What Erikson wrote about is a process that he argues human beings go through in terms of determining what our identities are. And by identity, he means who we are as a person, what's the person that we sort of present to the world around us. He argues that if you look at large numbers of human beings, typically you'll find this pattern where people are going through a process of sort of putting on and taking off different behaviors, different personas, different ways of acting, and that this process is a natural one. It's not something to be criticized or a matter of, you used to like this music and have these friends, now you have a different set of friends and you listen to different music or you do different things. Sometimes parents, family members, friends might see that kind of change as a bad thing. Erikson would probably argue that change is change, that human beings grow over time. Some ways of change may be more obvious or easier to see than others, but he would argue again that the takeaway here is that there is a process by which we go through to develop our identity, to develop our own understanding of who we are in the world. The big takeaway I want you to have from this chapter is that although it's a very complex topic, human development does follow patterns ultimately that can be understood, can be predicted, and this allows psychologists and others to better understand and even predict human behavior if we are familiar with these patterns of how humans grow and change over their lifetime, over the lifespan. That concludes today's video. I hope you've found this overview helpful for your own studies. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you found this video useful. It really helps my YouTube channel grow. Good luck with your continuing studies of psychology as well as with the rest of your college career. Take care.